The year is 1943. The war machine of the German Reich is at its zenith in Europe. But on the fringes of the North African continent, the tide has turned. For 2 years, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps fought a brilliant, often impossible war across the scorching sands. His tactical genius, the Desert Fox, made his troops the stuff of legend within the Wehrmacht. Now, that legend is shattered. In May 1943, following the successful Allied campaigns of Operation Torch and the Tunisia campaign, the Axis forces in North Africa are finally overwhelmed. A stunning total of 267,000 German and Italian troops are captured in a single, decisive surrender. This mass surrender creates an immediate, staggering logistical crisis for the United States. They have secured one of the most decisive victories of the war, but now they are faced with housing 250,000 of the enemy's toughest, most committed fighting men. Many of these men were Rommel's elite, hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps. The decision is made. The vast majority of these prisoners must be shipped across the Atlantic to the American mainland. The move is a necessity driven by cost, logistics, and security. But it sets the stage for a bizarre and forgotten chapter of the war. Far from the desolate battlefields of El Alamein and Tobruk, deep in the American South, a new kind of fortress is rising. The destination is Aliceville, Alabama, a small, remote town in Pickens County. It is here that the U.S. government established what would become the largest World War II prisoner of war camp in the southeastern United States. Construction of Camp Aliceville began rapidly in August 1942, designed to handle an enormous influx of German prisoners. The completed facility could hold up to 12,000 men at its peak, transforming the tiny southern community overnight. But Aliceville would not be a typical prison camp. It was built largely for the captured German officers and non-commissioned officers, and their presence would expose a profound paradox of modern warfare: the luxury of law. The foundation for this luxury was the 1929 Geneva Convention. Relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, the convention was a comprehensive, legally binding document that America, unlike its enemies, was determined to follow to the letter. Its provisions concerning officers were particularly critical to the experience at Aliceville. According to the convention, captured enemy officers and individuals of equivalent status could not be forced to work. Non-commissioned officers, NCOs, were only required to perform supervisory work unless they volunteered for more remunerative labor. Furthermore, officers were legally entitled to pay and a standard of living commensurate with their rank and an established allowance. For the American military authorities managing the influx of Rommel's captured officers, this meant they had to provide a facility that adhered to a high mandated standard of comfort. They were not building a harsh penal colony, but an internment center that reflected a certain legal standing. In June 1943, the first wave of prisoners arrived. They were battered men, shipped first across the Mediterranean, then over the Atlantic, before being packed into railcars for the final inland journey. Stepping off the train into the humid, sticky heat of Alabama was a profound shock to men used to the arid, cold nights of the North African desert. They had envisioned a stark, brutal confinement. Instead, they were greeted by the sprawling, newly constructed complex of Camp Aliceville. It was a small city behind barbed wire, complete with hundreds of frame barracks, its own hospital, and well-organized facilities. The sheer scale and the relative comfort, the very efficiency of the American detention system, was the first disorienting sign that their imprisonment would be radically different from the war they had fought. For the officers, segregated into their own dedicated compound, this adherence to the Geneva Convention meant their life in captivity would become a strange, unintended kind of cultural sabbatical. The hardest fighting men in Hitler's army had just been afforded an American vacation. The year is 1943. The sheer volume of Axis prisoners captured in North Africa, hundreds of thousands, presented the Allied forces with a staggering logistical problem. Where could such a massive population of hardened soldiers be safely and affordably contained? The answer was found across the Atlantic, the vast, secure mainland of the United States. However, the transfer was governed by an international law that would fundamentally shape the experience of these prisoners: the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The convention dictated a clear, critical distinction between captured officers and enlisted men. This was the precise mechanism that unlocked the luxury of Camp Aliceville. Under the convention, officers could not be forced to work, save for limited administrative duties, and they were legally entitled to a standard of living commensurate with their pay grade and rank in their own army. For high-ranking officers and non-commissioned officers of the elite Afrika Korps, this provision translated directly into better quarters, greater recreational opportunities, and the leisure time to pursue academic and cultural endeavors. The United States, determined to maintain a moral high ground and ensure its own captured soldiers received similar treatment from the Axis powers, strictly adhered to this protocol. To accommodate this massive influx, the U.S. Army embarked on an unprecedented construction program, quickly establishing over 500 POW camps across the country. The search for a suitable location for one of the largest camps led them to Aliceville, Alabama. It was a small, remote town in the rural west-central part of the state, isolated enough for maximum security, yet possessing good rail access, a crucial element for transporting thousands of men and supplies. On 830 acres of reclaimed farmland, the American military constructed a veritable city behind barbed wire. The project began in haste in August 1942, and by the time the first prisoners arrived, the facility was a testament to American wartime efficiency. The complex included an American compound, a hospital, and the German section, which was itself divided into separate compounds for officers and enlisted men. The finished site featured over 400 frame barracks and could house more than 6,000 prisoners, a number that occasionally swelled even higher. The design was modular, practical, and fast to erect, giving Aliceville the capacity to hold the bulk of the defeated Afrika Korps officer class. Yet, for 5 months, the massive complex sat largely empty, guarded by a small contingent of American military police. Then, on June 2, 1943, the first train carrying the defeated soldiers pulled into the small Frisco depot in Aliceville. Stepping off the train were the men who had once served. Field Marshal Rommel in the scorching deserts of North Africa, some 500 weary, desert-battered prisoners of war. They arrived in the sweltering, humid, and intensely green landscape of the Deep South, a world away from the dust and rock they had grown accustomed to. The shock of the climate and the sheer unexpected scale of the prison camp was palpable. The newly built compound, with its rows of pristine wooden barracks, mess halls, and vast recreation fields, awaited them. The officers were quickly ushered into their dedicated compound, where the stipulations of the Geneva Convention instantly elevated their standard of living above that of the enlisted men. They were provided with uniforms, regular meals, and the freedom from forced labor. This relative comfort quickly began to breed a strange, unsettling environment, one where defeated enemy officers were granted the unexpected luxury of time and resources to manage their own incarceration. It was here, within the officers' segregated compound, that the unique culture of Aliceville began to take root. The prisoners were encouraged to establish their own internal governance, and crucially, they created a full-fledged educational and cultural life. Officers who held academic credentials in civilian life became faculty for a camp school, offering university-level courses. Others, with musical backgrounds, formed orchestras using instruments often donated by the local community. The officers' time was occupied not by the grueling physical labor assigned to the enlisted ranks, but by study, sports, art, and music, providing an unexpected insulation from the brutality of war. The conditions at Aliceville were so comfortable, so far exceeding what many expected, that the vast majority of prisoners saw little incentive to risk escape. For the captured German officer, Alabama was not a place of punishment, but an unintended oasis, a strange sabbatical from the war. The year is 1942. The logistical nightmare of housing hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners of war, primarily from the decisive victory in Tunisia, forces the United States to rapidly execute a massive stateside construction program. A new city, built for the enemy, must rise from the remote fields of the American South. The War Department, seeking isolation and vast space, selected a site in Pickens County, Alabama, near the small, unassuming town of Aliceville. Construction on what would become one of the largest POW facilities in the United States began in August 1942. In a matter of months, a massive, self-contained city was erected, covering over 800 acres of ground. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of timber frame barracks, a hospital, administrative buildings, kitchens, and mess halls, all enclosed by concentric rings of barbed wire and guard towers. The final capacity was intended for up to 12,000 men, though the number of prisoners typically hovered just over 6,000. Camp Aliceville was activated in late 1942, but the true test came in the following year. On a sweltering June afternoon in 1943, the first trainloads arrived, carrying the elite soldiers of the fallen Afrika Korps. These were men hardened by the sands of the Sahara, veterans of tank battles and punishing heat, but nothing had prepared them for the humid subtropical oven of Alabama. Stepping off the rail cars, the officers and men who had served Field Marshal Erwin Rommel found themselves miles from any ocean, confronted not by the desert, but by the thick, green, suffocating landscape of the Deep South. Many of the prisoners were the highest-ranking and most experienced soldiers captured in the North Africa campaign. The camp was immediately organized to reflect the dictates of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which was scrupulously followed by the U.S. authorities. This meant a stark literal division, enlisted men in one compound, and a segregated, highly privileged compound for officers and equivalent non-commissioned officers, NCOs. It was in this segregated area that the luxury of war truly took root. German officers, based on their rank, were not compelled to perform labor and were entitled to a monthly pay, which they could spend on goods in the camp canteen. This financial stipend, combined with the non-labor clause, provided them with an environment far removed from the forced toil of an enlisted man's prison. It allowed the officer corps of the Wehrmacht to recreate an approximation of civilian academic and cultural life behind the wire. The officers of the Afrika Korps, many of whom were educated professionals in civilian life, swiftly established a comprehensive camp school. POWs, acting as instructors, taught classes in languages, engineering, mathematics, and even history. They formed a barbed wire college where academic credit could be earned, enabling some to continue their studies seamlessly upon repatriation. Culture thrived alongside education. The officers organized multiple camp orchestras, utilizing instruments procured through camp funds and, in some cases, donations from the surrounding American community. They staged elaborate theatrical productions, built recreation facilities for soccer and handball, and maintained extensive libraries. This was not the gray misery of a typical prison. It was a bizarre, enforced, self-sufficient academic and cultural retreat. For the American authorities, this relative comfort served a dual purpose. First, it ensured compliance with international law, protecting American POWs in German hands. Second, it created an environment so comparatively appealing that it actively discouraged the most violent or destructive impulses. The overall atmosphere was one of calculated contentment, world where the primary enemy was boredom, not hunger or brutal treatment. The fact that the captured elite could enjoy such privileges, including cultural life and education, was a testament to the strange paradox of Camp Aliceville, a place where the defeated German officer found himself in a peculiar temporary sanctuary, living a life of relative ease while the war raged on without him. The year is 1944. The Afrika Korps officers, now settled into the relative comfort of Camp Aliceville, find that the war they left behind in the desert has simply followed them, taking root inside the barbed wire. The physical battle is over, but the ideological one is raging, turning the prison camp into a volatile, segregated landscape. Not all men wore the swastika with the same conviction. While the prisoners of war were a formidable, elite fighting force, the majority were simply career soldiers, conscripts, or young men following orders. Historians estimate that fewer than 10% of the captured German population were devoted. Hardcore Nazis, the truer believers. These dedicated loyalists, however, often younger and intensely committed to the Reich, dominated the internal prisoner hierarchy. They maintained a strict code of silence and absolute adherence to Nazi ideology, creating a chilling atmosphere of internal surveillance. The anti-Nazis, or the simply disillusioned had to be cautious, as the Nazi element would try to intimidate them, causing considerable internal trouble. This division was a major challenge for the American camp authorities. Their ultimate goal was not just detention, but a subtle form of reconstruction, to expose these men to democratic ideals, to show them an alternative to the totalitarian state that had sent them to war. This was the task of the U.S. Army's ** Special Projects Division, SPD, ***, a specialized unit tasked with the ambitious, unprecedented undertaking of re-education. The SPD's strategy was simple: controlled exposure. They provided special publications, non-censored American magazines, approved films, and educational materials that highlighted democratic principles in American culture, all while avoiding overt propaganda that would spark outright revolt. The curriculum included everything from American history and democratic governance to philosophy and the arts. The goal was to plant seeds of doubt, to offer a vision of a post-Hitler Germany. But within Aliceville, particularly in the officers' compound, this program was met with fierce resistance. The pro-Nazi faction, still clinging to the hope of German victory, viewed the materials as nothing less than anti-Nazi propaganda, an insidious attempt by the enemy to corrupt the Wehrmacht soul. They actively boycotted the programs, often destroying the reading materials and threatening any prisoner who showed too much enthusiasm for the American curriculum. The internal conflict was a constant, unwritten war, pitting the loyalists against the pragmatists and the nascent Democrats. For the American Guards, managing this ideological civil war while strictly adhering to the Geneva Convention was a delicate, stressful affair. While the officers were largely confined to their complex, enjoying their privileged non-work status, the enlisted men and NCOs were utilized to alleviate the crushing labor shortage across the American South. The sheer number of men housed at Aliceville, which could range from 2,000 to a surge of 12,000, made it a vital manpower source. They were allowed to work outside the camp, supervised by armed guards, at a variety of tasks, often including farming, logging, and assisting local businesses. This interaction created the strange social fabric of Aliceville, Alabama. The arrival of the massive camp had already pumped up to $75,000 a week into the local economy, providing jobs in construction and maintenance. Now, German soldiers in uniforms marked with POW were a common sight in the fields. For the small, remote community, this was their closest, most surreal encounter with the enemy. While most prisoners had little direct, unsupervised contact with American civilians, the sight of German soldiers working alongside local farmers was a stark, bewildering reality of the war that had finally come home. The efficiency of the German labor and the professionalism of the posts often impressed the rural population. Yet the ideological struggle between good and evil remained locked away, hidden behind the triple rows of barbed wire. The outside world saw men working the land. The American government saw a chance to save a generation from fascism. The year is 1944. The war in Europe rages, but for the thousands of German officers in Alabama, the fight has become internal. Within the 3 square miles of Camp Aliceville, the barbed wire does not merely separate the prisoners from America. It also delineates a harsh, unwritten line between German and German. This was not a unified population awaiting repatriation. Instead, the Afrika Korps prisoners were sharply and dangerously divided. On one side stood the truer believers the hardcore Nazis, often younger, fiercely loyal, and ideologically committed to Hitler. They sought to maintain the discipline and terror of the Reich even within the confines of a foreign prison camp. They formed an intimidating shadow government, ready to punish any perceived weakness or disloyalty among their countrymen. On the other side were the so-called white elephants, the cooperative elements, the disillusioned, or simply those officers whose pragmatic focus was survival and a return to their shattered homes. These men were under constant scrutiny and threat. To show interest in American life, to cooperate with the guards, or to simply express doubt about the Führer was to risk brutal, even fatal, retribution from their own comrades. The American Guards were tasked with managing an enemy force, but they quickly realized they were also navigating a volatile, ideological civil war unfolding directly beneath the watchtowers. The United States government, aware of this ideological schism, initiated a formal attempt to break the hold of Nazism. This was the reorientation program, often dubbed the intellectual diversion program. Its goal was not merely to occupy the prisoners' time, but to actively expose them to the ideals of democracy, to plant the seeds for a de-Nazified post-war Germany. It was the first time the United States had attempted a psychological mass intervention on such a scale. The tools of this re-education effort were subtle but clear. American authorities supplied the camp libraries with books on political philosophy, history, and the U.S. Constitution. They provided access to select American films and lectures designed to highlight the failures of totalitarianism. Most importantly, the prisoners were given access to a new German-language newspaper called *Der Ruf*. The Call, a publication specially curated by the U.S. Army to promote democratic ideals. To the hardcore Afrika Korps officers at Aliceville, this was not re-education. It was propaganda. The officers, especially, met the program with intellectual contempt and ideological resistance. Many were well-educated men who viewed the materials as crude, anti-German attempts at brainwashing. They organized lectures of their own, maintaining a rigid adherence to military protocol and Nazi values to counteract the American influence. They controlled the camp schools, ensuring the curriculum reflected their own worldview. The resistance was so pronounced that Camp Aliceville became known among U.S. authorities as one of the hardest camps in which to carry out the re-education mandate. The friction became violence. The true believers maintained a deadly internal code of honor. An officer suspected of collaborating might be ostracized, beaten, or worse. The American camp command had to make difficult, pragmatic decisions, sometimes physically separating the most cooperative or safe prisoners into different compounds, or transferring the worst offenders to maximum security camps. Managing the peace behind the wire meant respecting the German military hierarchy when it was convenient, but stepping in with decisive American force when life was threatened. Outside the camp, the local community of Aliceville, Alabama, faced its own adjustment. A small, remote southern town, it was suddenly transformed into a logistical hub for thousands of enemy soldiers. Local residents were hired as civilian workers' clerks, cooks, laundry staff, necessitating a strange, routine interaction with the German prisoners. There was a profound sense of fear and curiosity in equal measure. Locals often drove past the high, barbed wire fences to witness the surreal sight of enemy men playing soccer, engaging in sports, or simply living with a level of comfort that seemed contradictory to their status as captured soldiers. Though the distance was maintained by the wire and the humid air, an unintended cultural exchange was occurring. For the Aliceville residents, the enemy was no longer a distant, abstract threat. They were men behind a fence, working, laughing, and sometimes fighting amongst themselves, revealing the complex human face of a war that had unexpectedly arrived on the peaceful soil of the American South.